The dust of the town square tastes like malice. It coats the back of Alara's throat, a gritty testament to the collective judgment that has left her kneeling here. Her son, Leo, is a small, trembling weight clutched to her chest, his face buried in the coarse fabric of her torn bodice. Before them, the town doctor, a man whose hands smell of carbolic soap and indifference, straightens up from his brief examination. He wipes his fingers on his trousers as if touching her has soiled him. "She's broken, Sheriff," he announces to the raw-boned man standing over them, the man who ordered this. "The flesh might knit, but the woman won't mend. Not from this." The words are a final verdict, another lash laid across her soul. Won't mend. They echo the whispers that have followed her for weeks, the cold stares, the pronouncements of her worthlessness. She feels the truth of it in the deep, fiery agony of her back, in the hollow space where her will to live used to be. All that remains is the instinct to shield her child. A shadow falls over them, long and lean in the unforgiving afternoon sun. Boots crunch softly in the dirt, stopping a few feet away. Alara doesn't look up. It is just another spectator to her ruin. "What was her crime?" a low voice asks. The sound is different, not sharp with accusation, but rumbling and steady, like stones shifting deep in the earth. Sheriff Brand spits a brown stream of tobacco juice near Alara's bare foot. "Theft. A side of bacon and 2 sacks of flour from the mercantile. Property of Judge Thorne. Food for her boy," the voice says. It is not a question. "The law is the law," the sheriff grunts, unimpressed. "Thorne wanted an example made. 100 lashes. It's done." Silence stretches, thick and heavy with the heat, and the flies buzzing over the trough. Alara dares a glance from beneath the tangled mess of her hair. The man is a cowboy, plain and simple. His hat is sweat-stained, his face weathered by 1,000 suns, his clothes durable but worn. He is unremarkable in every way, except for the look in his pale blue eyes as they rest not on her wounds, but on the top of her son's head. A man who does this to a mother in front of her child ain't making an example, the cowboy says, his voice dangerously quiet. He's advertising his own wickedness. The sheriff's hand drifts to the butt of his pistol. "You got a stake in this, stranger." The cowboy ignores him. His gaze finally meets Alara's. She sees no pity in his eyes, which would be an insult. She sees no lust, which would be a threat. She sees only a profound and unsettling stillness, a recognition of her pain that asks for nothing in return. He takes a step closer, kneeling down so his face is level with hers, a courtesy no one has shown her in months. He speaks to her, his voice so soft it is almost lost to the wind. "Ma'am," he begins, and the simple honorific is so unexpected it almost breaks her. "My name is Silas. I have a place a day's ride from here. It's quiet. There's a well with clean water and a roof that don't leak." He pauses, his eyes flicking to the raw, weeping state of her back, visible through the tatters of her dress. His jaw tightens for a fraction of a second. He looks back at her, his expression resolute. "It'll be a hard ride, but I swear on my own soul, I'll be tender each move. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe." The sheriff laughs, a harsh, grating sound. "Take her, then. Damaged goods." Thorne's done with her. He gestures dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "Her and the boy. See if you can mend what's broken." And with that pronouncement, Silas's pledge hung in the air, a fragile promise in a brutal world. His life, and what was left of hers, were irrevocably changed. The journey was a slow-motion study in agony. Silas had bought a threadbare blanket from the mercantile, the same one she was accused of stealing from, and patted the floor of his buckboard as best he could. He had helped her into the back, his touch so light and impersonal it was more terrifying than a blow. Alara had expected roughness, a proprietary grip. Instead, his hands were calloused but careful, moving with an economy and gentleness that was utterly foreign. She lay on her stomach, her arms wrapped around a sleeping Leo, her cheek pressed against the rough-sawn planks of the wagon bed. Silas kept his word. He drove the team at a funereal pace, skirting the deepest ruts and guiding the horses around rocks that would have otherwise sent a jolt of pure fire through her body. Every few hours, he would stop, not saying a word, and bring her a tin cup of water from his canteen. He'd hold it for her, his face impassive, while she drank. He offered Leo a piece of dried apple, which the boy took with wide, watchful eyes before scurrying back to his mother's side. They traveled through a landscape that was as wounded as she felt. The plains were cracked and thirsty, the grass baked to a pale gold. The mesas in the distance were stark and bruised purple in the setting sun. It was a land that didn't offer comfort, only the hard truth of survival. By the time they arrived at his homestead, darkness had fallen completely, and a bone-deep chill had settled in the air. The cabin was small, just one room with a stone hearth and a sleeping loft. It was spare and impeccably clean. A solitary cot stood against one wall, a larger bed in the loft above. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. It was the home of a man who lived with ghosts, a place scrubbed clean of memory. Silas carried Leo inside, the boy having finally succumbed to an exhausted sleep. He placed him gently on the cot, pulling a worn quilt over him. Then he turned back to Alara, who had managed to pull herself to her feet and was leaning against the doorframe, swaying with pain and fatigue. "The cot is for you and the boy," he said, his voice as quiet as it had been in the town square. "I'll sleep up in the loft." He built a fire in the hearth, the crackle and pop of the kindling the only sound in the room. He moved with a quiet efficiency, fetching a bucket of water from the well, setting a pot to warm over the flames. He didn't look at her, giving her the space to simply exist, to breathe without fear of demand. Later, he brought a bowl of thin broth to her. She was huddled on the edge of the cot, watching her son's chest rise and fall. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the savory scent reached her. She took the bowl with trembling hands, avoiding his gaze. The hardest part came after. He returned from the fire with a basin of warm water and a clean rag. He set it on a stool beside the cot. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and even, "those wounds need cleaning. If you'll let me." Terror, cold and absolute, seized her. To be touched there, where the pain was a living entity, was unthinkable. To be that vulnerable to a man, a stranger, a whimper escaped her lips before she could stop it. Her entire body tensed, preparing for a blow that didn't come. Silas didn't move. He simply stood there, his hands loose at his sides. "I won't force you," he said. "But fever is a cruel master. I can leave the basin here for you. Or I can help. The choice is yours." He turned his back to her then, giving her privacy to make her choice, and began to check the harness leather from his team, his movements methodical and slow. Alara watched his broad back, the way the firelight played across his worn shirt. He was offering her a choice. No one had offered her a choice in a very long time. With a shuddering breath that felt like it was tearing her in two, she slowly, painfully, began to unfasten the front of her ruined dress, her mind screaming while some braver part of her whispered that this was the only way. When he heard the soft rustle of cloth, he turned back. He approached the cot with the same deliberate calm he'd shown all day. He knelt, not like a supplicant, but like a craftsman approaching a delicate task. He dipped the rag in the warm water, wrung it out, and hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering in the air. "This will hurt," he said, his voice a low apology. It did. Every dab of the warm cloth was a fresh torment, pulling screams from her throat that she managed to choke back into ragged gasps. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. But through the haze of pain, she registered the facts of his touch. His hands were steady. He was painstakingly gentle, cleaning around the edges of the worst welts, his movements careful and precise. He worked in silence, his breath a soft, rhythmic sound in the quiet cabin. He was not a doctor, but he was patient. He was tender. When he was finished, he applied a thin layer of a pungent, greasy salve from a small tin. It smelled of pine and something else, something medicinal and soothing. He helped her lie down again and draped a clean, thin sheet over her, careful to let it tint over her back so nothing touched the raw skin. He did all of this without a word of pity, without a single flicker of disgust or desire in his eyes. When he was done, he simply picked up the basin and walked back to the fire. Alara lay in the darkness, listening to the sound of her own ragged breathing and the steady, comforting presence of the man moving about in the small cabin. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a single, fragile thought took root in the barren soil of her mind. maybe I will not die here. The days that followed fell into a quiet, fragile rhythm. Silas rose before the sun, his movements in the loft above a soft shuffling that no longer made her flinch. He would be gone for hours, tending to his small herd of cattle, mending fences, doing the 1,000 solitary tasks required to keep a homestead from being reclaimed by the wilderness. He always left food on the table for her and Leo, a pot of oatmeal, a heel of bread, a bowl of beans from the night before. Leo was the first to thaw. Children, bless their resilient hearts, can find the sunlight in the darkest of rooms. He was wary of Silas at first, a small shadow clinging to his mother's cot. But Silas never pushed. He'd simply talk to the boy as he worked around the cabin in the evenings, his voice a low, steady rumble. He told him about the hawk that nested in the tall cottonwood by the creek, about a coyote he'd seen with a limp, about the way the stars looked different when you were far from any town. One afternoon, Silas sat on the porch step, carving a piece of scrap wood with his pocket knife. Leo watched, mesmerized, from the doorway. After an hour of focused work, Silas had fashioned a rough but unmistakable horse. He sanded it smooth with a piece of rock and held it out to the boy without a word. Leo hesitated, looking back at his mother. Alara, watching from her cot, gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The boy darted forward, snatched the wooden horse, and scurried back to the safety of the cabin, clutching his new treasure. It was a beginning. Alara's body healed with agonizing slowness. The fire in her back subsided into a constant, deep ache. She began to move around the cabin, her steps stiff and shuffling. She started to help in small ways. She would fold the blankets Silas washed, her fingers clumsy and slow. She would stir the pot of stew he left simmering on the hearth. Each small act was a reclamation of herself. She was more than just a body that had been wounded. She was a woman who knew how to keep a home, a mother who knew how to nurture. She still hadn't spoken a word to him. The silence between them was vast, filled with the unspoken horrors of her past and the quiet sorrows of his. Yet, it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a space where they could simply be, without the need for explanation or justification. The turning point came one night when a nightmare clawed its way out of her sleep. She woke with a strangled cry, the phantom sting of the whip on her back, the scent of Sheriff Brand's tobacco in her nostrils. She sat bolt upright, gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs. Instantly, she heard movement from the loft. A moment later, Silas was standing by her cot, a lantern held aloft. The soft light illuminated his face, etched with concern. He didn't reach for her, didn't speak. He just stood there, a silent guardian in the dark. "He was here," she whispered, the words rusty and cracked from disuse. Her own voice sounded strange to her ears. "The sheriff." Silas's expression hardened. He pulled one of the chairs from the table and set it near her cot, then sat down. He didn't say, it was just a dream. He didn't offer empty platitudes. "He ain't here now," Silas said, his voice firm. "And he ain't comin' here. This is my land. You're safe here." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, for the first time. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the deep-seated loneliness that seemed to cling to him like dust. He was a solitary man in a harsh world, yet he had opened his door to a broken woman and her child. "Why?" she asked, the question a raw whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Silas stared into the flickering flame of the lantern for a long moment, as if the answer were written there. "I had a wife once," he said softly, his gaze distant. "And a daughter. Fever took 'em both one winter. The cabin got quiet. Too quiet." He looked back at her, his eyes holding a sorrow so profound it made her own ache in sympathy. "I reckon I just don't like to see cruelty win. And a boy needs his mother." It was the most he had ever said about himself. The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge built across their separate islands of pain. Alara pulled the quilt tighter around herself. "Thank you," she said, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the words felt like they were enough. As the weeks turned into a month, a semblance of life began to bloom in the small cabin. Leo's laughter became a common sound as he followed Silas around, helping with chores. Alara's movements grew more fluid. The deep ache in her back was a constant companion, but it no longer ruled her every motion. She learned to cook on the hearth, her simple meals a welcome change from Silas's bachelor fare. She mended their clothes with neat, practiced stitches. One evening, as she was darning one of Silas's shirts by the firelight, he watched her, his expression unreadable. Her hair, which had been a matted tangle, was now clean and brushed, tied back with a piece of string. The hollows in her cheeks had begun to fill out. The fear in her eyes was still there, but it was no longer a wild, panicked thing. It was a watchful ember, not a raging fire. He had gone into town for supplies 2 days prior, the first time he'd left them alone for more than a few hours. The fear had been a cold knot in her stomach the entire time he was gone, but he had returned just as he'd promised, his wagon laden with flour, salt, and a small bag of peppermint sticks for Leo. "Heard some talk in town," Silas said, breaking the comfortable silence. Alara's fingers stilled on the shirt. She didn't look up. "What talk?" "Judge Thorne ain't happy," he said. "He told some folks at the saloon he considers you his property. That the lashing was a correction, not a release. He's talking about sending the sheriff out to fetch you back." The needle slipped from her fingers, falling silently onto the wooden floor. The blood drained from her face. To go back there, to that man, to that town, it was a fate worse than death. The fragile piece she had found shattered into a million pieces. Silas saw the terror in her eyes. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt in front of her, just as he had in the town square. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid wall between her and the world. "Alara," he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips was both strange and wonderful. "Look at me." She forced her gaze up to meet his. "I told you that you were safe here," he said, his voice a low, fierce promise. "I meant it. This is our home now. Let him come." The conviction in his voice was absolute. He wasn't just offering her shelter anymore. He was offering her a fortress. In that moment, watching the resolute set of his jaw, Alara knew that this quiet, lonely man would die before he let anyone harm her or her son again. A wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath washed over her. Gratitude, fear, and something else, something warm and terrifyingly new. Hope. The dust kicked up by the 2 horses was visible from a mile away. Silas saw it from the ridge where he was checking on a new calf. He knew immediately who it was. He'd been expecting them. He untied his rifle from his saddle, not with haste, but with a deliberate, grim certainty. He rode back to the cabin at a steady pace. Alara had seen the dust cloud too. She was standing in the doorway, her face pale, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. Leo was clinging to her leg, his small face buried in her skirt. The wooden horse Silas had carved for him was clutched tightly in his fist. When Silas dismounted, he didn't go inside. He stood in front of the porch, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He looked at Alara. "Take the boy inside. Stay away from the window." "Silas," she began, her voice trembling. "It'll be all right," he said, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. "This has to be settled." She obeyed, herding a whimpering Leo into the dark interior of the cabin. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Sheriff Brand and a smirking, well-dressed man who could only be Judge Thorne reined in their horses a dozen yards from the cabin. Thorne, a man with a fleshy face and small, cruel eyes, surveyed the meager homestead with a sneer. "Silas, is it?" the judge called out, his voice oily and self-important. "We've come for my property." "She ain't property," Silas replied, his voice calm and clear. "She's a woman, and she's not going anywhere." Sheriff Brand shifted in his saddle, his hand resting on his gun. "Now, listen here," he started. "The judge has a claim. She's an indentured servant, to work off her thieving. The lashing was just the down payment on her debt." "A piece of paper you wrote after the fact don't make it right," Silas said, his knuckles white where he gripped his rifle. "You tortured a woman for being hungry. There ain't a law in God's creation that makes that just. Law is what I say it is in this county." Thorne snapped, his face reddening. "I'm talking her back. She'll learn her lesson this time. And as for you, for harboring her, you'll find yourself in a cell." The cabin door creaked open. Alara stepped out onto the porch. She stood tall, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with a fire Silas had never seen before. Leo was right behind her, his small hand gripping hers. She moved to stand beside Silas, a silent, unshakable declaration. Thorne's eyes widened, first in surprise, then in fury. He looked from the defiant woman to the resolute cowboy standing beside her. He saw not a broken victim and her foolish protector, but a unified front. A family. "I am not your property," Alara said, her voice shaking but clear and strong. It carried across the dusty yard, a sound of pure steel. "You beat me for feeding my child. You left me to die? You have no claim on me." The judge was momentarily speechless. He had expected a cowering, broken creature. This woman, with her scarred back and fierce eyes, was a stranger to him. "You'll hang for this, cowboy," he finally sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at Silas. Silas took a half-step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Alara. "Maybe," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "But not today. And you'll not be laying a hand on her, or the boy. This is my land. You've come here uninvited, making threats. I'd say it's high time you leave." He didn't raise the rifle. He didn't need to. The promise of violence in his stance was more potent than any overt threat. Sheriff Brand looked from Silas's cold eyes to the judge's blustering rage and made a calculation. A fight here, on this man's land, was a fool's errand. He leaned over and spoke in a low tone to Thorne. The judge argued for a moment, his face purple with indignation, but the sheriff was insistent. With a final, venomous glare, Thorne wrenched his horse around. "This isn't over," he yelled over his shoulder. "Yes," Silas called back to their retreating backs. "It is." They watched until the riders were nothing more than a smudge of dust on the horizon. The sudden silence was vast and profound. The immediate danger had passed. Alara felt a tremor run through her body, the delayed shock of the confrontation. Silas turned to her. His face was grim, but his eyes were soft. He looked at her, standing there so proudly, then down at Leo, who was peering out from behind her skirts. The world of pain and fear that had defined their lives seemed to shrink, replaced by the small, solid patch of ground on which they stood. He reached out, his calloused hand moving slowly, giving her time to pull away. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was warm. She did not flinch. Instead, for the first time, she leaned into his touch, a small, barely perceptible movement that was a surrender and a victory all at once. He let his hand rest there for a beat, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. The scars on her back would never fully fade, but as she stood beside him in the warm afternoon sun, with the sound of her son breathing safely beside her, Alara knew the doctor had been wrong. She was mending. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.